Hi guys, so a little bit of housekeeping before this episode with Dr. Bill Sutherland. What a time it has been. I haven't been doing a great deal with the podcast, but there's been a lot going on in other fronts and realities of my life, including the private practice calls, and just making a lot of new really promising connections. Like there's a really felt sense of like going from one really meaningful call every several months to call after call after call, and each one you're like dropping into a space of really sort of alive, potential filled space with somebody, and I don't really know what the full potential and kind of collaborations that are going to come out of these friendships, but it's really exciting, and it really feeds into my sense of what's going on and where I am. So that is awesome, and this conversation was one of those recent conversations of just meeting someone really really deeply interesting, and someone that has wisdom for me to partake of in participating with. So yeah, Bill Sutherland, Dr. William Sutherland. I'm going to keep mumbling the name. Somebody that I tracked down through his dialogue with Zach Stein, and then I found his website, Complexity Medicine, and really just aesthetically connected with his project and the vibe and the way that they were bringing together art making and complexity, thinking relating to complexity. So yeah, that's Complexity Medicine, but Bill is a very experienced medical doctor. He's done general practitioner roles. He's works now in frontline mental health care in a hospital in Toronto, I believe. And yeah, we really just had we really connected in a really nice way through the dialogue, and that was the biggest takeaway for me. And I think he reminded me of some things, but the content was also a wonderful exploration of the nature of conducting dialogue, I suppose, but more specifically, we talked about the nature of shamanism and what it is to the way in which indigenous peoples would read the world, read the environment when participating in day-to-day life and in a hunt. And so yeah, what is it to hunt for wisdom in that way, and to really be deeply listening for sort of whisper-like patterns in the world and things that are calling you, and what is the quality of that calling. And so yeah, I don't want to give too much away. Kalahari Bushman, working in a hospital, lots of different threads. Really, I think Bill really stresses bringing story and context into thinking, and that's something that I am drawn to as well. So yeah, that is the upcoming episode. And the last piece of housekeeping: Men Emerging is a men's initiative that I'm launching on October 31st. It's a men's group, but it is a project with its own vision and sensibility, and yeah, it builds off the experience of running a number of men's groups in the past year and participating and really discovering a lot of value and meaning. So yeah, you can find all of that on my website and learn more about that Men Emerging initiative. So thank you for listening to this more substantial introduction. The episode will begin. Unfortunately, in the recording, we only got Bill's face. We didn't get my face, so you're going to see a still image of me and a wonderful video of Bill. Thank you. All right, welcome, Bill. Dr. William Sutherland from Complexity Medicine. By way of introduction, came across your channel, Complexity Medicine, some time ago. Connected with you over your dialogue with Zach Stein, and then ended up reading your book, which you were kind enough to send to me, and that was a real sort of gem and discovery of a lot of different threads brought together in a really interesting dialectical way. The book itself being through sort of dialogues and shifting perspectives and dreams. So I'm happy to jump into this pretty spontaneous conversation with you and see what we can explore around what is the nature of complexity medicine, how shamanism might be related to this in a contemporary context, and what it is to be of service to wholeness.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me here, Jacob. I appreciate it. Yeah. I think it's probably good to start by just saying that how, both of us have come, both of us, maybe a little bit of starting with our sort of miscommunication, which is a lovely thing. Your thought today would be preparatory, and my thought today would be, the interviewing, dialoguing process. And I love that there's that mismatch to start off, right? Because we all of a sudden, rather than a resonance or a coherence, we have this lovely dissonance, right? This misstep, this misbeat that has been, the stone that's dropped in the pond and the wake and the ripple that comes off of that. And, and I think that's fun to play with that skillfully. And, if we look to a metaphor where that gets used all the time, of course, is jazz music, right? Mm-hmm. Where the missteps, the misbeats, the unseen direction, becomes the whole thing that we riff off. Or, you think about improv comedy, truly when the comedian is interacting with the audience, the sense of not knowing, a surprise coming forth in some way. And then how do we then play with that, right, in a comic form? So, I'm just very grateful that you're open to running with, the possibility of this recording. I mean, this recording may never see the light of day. That's fine too. But just the fact that we are, willing to engage that, I find that a wonderful, wonderful start.
It's a wonderful framing, by the way, and it really clicks with my experience of like doing this one-to-one, but stepping into a context of 4 or 5 or 8 people and being the one in the hot seat. It does feel like a live play that can happen in conversation, and being a better instrument of that is sort of at the heart of my project right now. So whatever discordance and confusion is right where it needs to be for my practice.
Yeah. Very good. So we'll start with the living moment right now. And maybe one of the things, if I just, maybe boldly, because we had that couple of minutes of talking beforehand, and you shared something that I just found really fascinating, and I have found fascinating, right? The notion of, I think you mentioned, well, this is my first time interviewing a physician, right? A medical doctor. And you noticed in the midst of that, all of this contextual organizing coming forth, like including the urge to talk about something medical or something personally medical with this doctor, or what have you, right? And I just love that you had that observation, and that sort of innate organizing was already in play, right? I don't know, does that sound like a good place to sort of ambush you with your own
Totally.
Your own piece back at you? But how does that sound as a place to start?
Yes, that's a great place to start. And I had also compared it to the impulse around a priest to confess. And so, but I think what you were alluding to is that there's also a really essential and important component of that very ingrained impulse.
Yeah. And notice already how, again, ingrained impulses, right, that we're going into the abstract. But when you shared to me about that notion of the priest, it was actually about a relative, and it was a real experience. And I
Yes.
wondered if you could tell the story of that, because I think that that actually holds, even if it's a small story, it holds it, I think, in an even more poignant way than just sort of the notion of the abstractions, right, that we're going to be pulled
Yeah.
into otherwise.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm just going to close my window. Yeah, so my grandfather grew up as a Catholic altar boy in a town in Poole in the south of England, where I also grew up. And he went to a school with Catholic nuns, and it was probably the 50s or 60s, so the nuns were pretty nasty back then. And a lot of people came away with a bad feeling for Catholicism. So he always would crack very funny jokes about the Catholic Church, and but yeah, I think my mother once somehow, like, her friend was the daughter of the priest, and the priest was going to sort of be invited around the home, and my grandfather was like, oh no, because there's this guilt complex in relationship to the priesthood of confessing one's sins, but then also like some, I don't know, some aversion mixed in with that. But yeah, I've often thought about sort of the disappearance of priests, and then the appearance of sort of therapists and other caregivers, and how there might be a real continuity of the underlying relationship.
I love that. I think that's an observation too. We should look back at it in a second here. I have an answer with a story to your story, right?
Nice.
Which is an interesting one. So my first job out of medical school, I worked on a First Nations Native reservation reserve. I'm in Canada, and from just broadcasting from outside of Toronto here. But this was on Canada's east coast in Nova Scotia, on a place called Cape Breton Island. And the native people there are the Mi'kmaq people. And I worked on a Mi'kmaq reserve. It was lovely experience, lovely people, lovely sense of community. And it was a wonderful first exposure to medicine, and it was a chain. It's where I wanted to be, because I had spent a lot of time with different communities in Canada for, in other modes and other reasons. And so one of my patients was a quite renowned Mi'kmaq elder. Her name was Carolyn. And she was sort of the elder's elder. I mean, she spoke an immaculate high Mi'kmaq language. She was a master basket maker. She knew the traditional medicines. And she was my patient. She was just a lovely person. And once a week, she would invite me over to the house, along with the Catholic priest. Because Catholicism and the Mi'kmaq people, there's a very long history, a very interesting historical connection, where they actually had a direct alliance and allegiance with the Vatican, not with the English or with the French. Like, they had this sort of special alliance and treaty. So it put a whole different history as it related to their community of people. So there it would be the native elder, the priest, and the doctor coming together for lunch. And you can see this is the beginning of a bad joke in some way, right? As the elder, the priest, and the doctor get together for lunch, you can imagine how those punchlines could come out. But it was a really fascinating thing, because we were brought together because of the stations we inhabited, right? Like, I mean, it was because of the fact that I was a doctor and the priest was a priest, and she was an elder in the community, and we would share in her fare and her cooking. But the interesting thing is that even though that we were brought together for a certain reason, what our conversations were rarely anything to do with that, right? So we were brought together in the notion of, these sort of stations that we inhabited in our working life, or in our titled life. But when we got there, it was about the food, it was about the afternoon, it was about small talk, it was about stories. So somehow in all of that, we had this way that we were able to transcend the very reasons we were gathered to be there, and come into this lovely collective of conversation. But the one thing I've always noticed, and this is really important, and And, as you were speaking earlier, you said, I had this impulse, right, to talk to me as a doctor and bring up something, related to my own health in whatever that small context is, right, that we talk to doctors about. And, this is just, this is one of those direct insights as to how we see how we're scripted, right? I mean, the doctor's office script. You've been inculcated into it and indoctrinated into it since you were a small lad, right? I mean, you go to the doctor when you are sick, right? You go for your shots, you go for your this, you go for your that. But it's a kind of very scripted dance, right? From the receptionist through to the nurse, through to when the doctor sees you, and even the mode of the doctor, as we go through our questions, our exams, our diagnosis, our prescription. So there's something very familiar. And what you realize, it isn't just the doctors that are doing it, it's the patients it's a dance. The patients organize as well too. There's an expectation by the patient that this happen, right? Patients don't come for no reason. They come because they're, quote, sick, and they would like an answer or solution to their sickness, right? Something that's going to help them, either in terms of information or more specifically in treatment. And so we have this funny illness-centric dance in this case and it's very habitual, right? Like, we know this and we want to move into this mode, right? And that's fine. But it is an illness-centric, disease-centric way of seeing. And it'd be really weird, right? Like, if you showed up at your doctor's one day and this doctor said, hey, like, why are you here? You're like, oh, no reason. I just wanted to come and tell you how good I'm doing. I just want to tell you, life is really going really well now. And other than that, that's it. I just wanted to update you and let you know. And I imagine the doctor would be quite shocked as well too, right? In terms of, and who knows what the response, like, why are you here wasting my time? Or that's wonderful, or other little ways that you could imagine sabotaging from the disease illness centric, right? Like, I sometimes say to my patients, I run a psychotherapy group, and I say, well, do you ever ask your doctors how they're doing, when you come in? And of course, that's not the job of the patient, but I mean, as social creatures in community, right? And you come in and the doctor looks exhausted, or hard day, or this or that, and remembering that they're a human too, and say, well, hey doc, how are you doing today? And so I've done this little experiment, asking patients to go out into the world with their family doctors and try this, or their specialists. And it's almost universally a great response, right? A response of real rapport and a chance for human connectedness within the specific relationship, which is directional, but it all of a sudden humanizes it, right? It leaves space for things like empathy, right, between each other. So, I started off in general practice as a rural family doctor, and I moved into hospital with emergent hospice work. And now I'm in a mental health specific sort of context of primary mental health care and psychotherapy. But there is a chance now in this dialogue of the nature of talk therapy and psychotherapy and being in presence with each other this way, that we can actually create things that are health centric, right? Like, we don't have to always go back and reify the notion that we're here for disease or illness. I mean, certainly struggle and difficulty and moving through those things do come up, but can we actually hold that always in the broader frame of our health, rather than inverting that and putting the broader frame our illness? So just you watching how you want to organize in that way, right? I think that's fascinating. I do have one little notion too of a step, because you mentioned about shamanism, but there is a step out of the priest and the doctor and the elder, like all of these places, like that story of the three of us in Cape Breton at Carolyn's dinner table, that I think would be a good leap. But before I go there, I just want to create some space and just sort of hear your sense of response, to that.
Yeah, it's fascinating for me, and I'm feeling into a lot of different sort of analogous kinds of tensions around context and lack of context, or knowing and not knowing based orientations and context, which is sort of where I'm rubbing up against. I'm sort of rubbing up against something and getting acquainted with this broader tendency and disposition towards context-driven context, where there is something that something is about, and trying to bring not knowing context, where we're oriented toward a deeper inquiry into what it might be or what is emerging, that brings out a lot of challenge. And for me, I'm in the process of navigating how do I create and hold that space with the sufficient minimum viable framing and orientation in order that the participants can safely give over trust to then, and not only give over trust, but feel that they are autonomous and sovereign entering into the place of not knowing. So that's sort of a very well-developed circumstance that's very present with me right now, and I'm sort of feeling the relationship between the two as you're speaking.
Are you open to me pushing into that a little bit?
You can go wherever you want.
I noticed it was interesting, the word trying to bring context, trying to bring. That caught me as interesting. And the responsibility taking for the participants to feel safe in whatever the contextual unfolding is. But let's start with the trying to bring context. I mean, the lovely thing about context is there's always context. It might be a really impoverished context. It might be a completely unexamined context. It might be just, a habitual reactive context. But there's always context, even if it's piss poor, right? So my thought is, and rather than trying to bring another context, right, as an imposition into it, because then there's a lot of thoughts in that, right, that this context is better than that context, and that this context will be more skillful, and this will provide this. Like, there's a lot of endpoint expectation in the idea of trying to bring a context in the beginning. You're really being driven by something at the end, right? Like, you're really on the pull now of expectations rather than presence. So if you let go of the trying to bring, I mean, just that simple, letting go of trying to bring, would we still have context? We sure, right? We still have a context. It might be just like silence.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what to talk about in between, because the context is either so bare or so foreign or so threatening, in whatever the case may be, but there's still context. So this idea of trying to bring context, I'd say be careful. It's in my own thought, because I've similarly, okay, what do I want to, what's my intention? What do I want to create here? What is the context that we're going to build from? But often I'm just working from the fantasy of my expectation, which is really of the projection of my past that I'm putting out there into this thing called the future, and really ignoring what is the presence of this moment here, because this moment is context filled. For certain it is. And then the notion of safety, right? Like, I don't like, in many ways, and this is maybe just my own thing, but I had pushed back against that. Like, I haven't asked or need you to keep me safe in our shared context. I'm a participant in it, right? I can speak to boundaries. I can push to new directions. I can add in layers of my own things to say, to help co-create it. And I can either, and as can you, and we can either receive or reject that. I don't think negotiation is safe, right? Like, the negotiative space. I mean, there has maybe I think the difference between safe and bounded. I think it does need to be bounded. That there's a sense of either spoken or unspoken boundaries, and that could just be simple respect and good manners, or or whatever the unfolding nature of the rules are. And the rules can change, but again, we always have the sense of working within the boundary conditions. But I wouldn't confuse that with safety, right? I wouldn't confuse that with safety. Because at some point, if the thing in all this is, I can say, I'm done now. I don't want to be in this anymore. And I can remove myself out, right? Like, I have that ability to sort of pull myself out. So yeah, and again, I know it's a loaded word these days, safety, and I don't really want to get into the notion of the loadedness of it, other than maybe just put it forth as a question. Like what is, let me ask you, like, what is the role for safety as we explore the context?
Yeah, well, first of all, to say that that feels fairly true for me, like that desire to push back on that. And it's not a word that I've found myself using very much at all, having any relationship with, until quite recently. I think dispositionally, I'm much more inclined to Like I want to give my own awareness by speaking into the context that I'm experiencing. But I dispositionally want to move sort of from being foregrounded to becoming the background and just becoming a very attentive space in which everything that's occurring can be sort of attended to, and then to sort of intervene and participate in certain moments, but not as a person with a role as such. I want to transition from the role into the co-participation place as soon as possible. And I want to ultimately get to a place where whatever container is initially created can sort of dissolve into what actually is going on. But what I'm getting in my life leading me into like facilitating group dialogos and hoping to sort of bring that to contexts where there's less familiarity, is that I almost need to foreground and perform what it is that I'm talking about in order to be able to step back and just observe and let the sort of chaos and interaction occur.
Yeah, I think we're really pushing into the important sort of parts, even in our short talk so far, right? We're seeing the tensions come forward. And so this notion of, well, like I'd like to just release into the co-creation of this conversation, this dialogos, this sort of the ebb and flow of it in a natural way. But at the same point, you mentioned, that there is the actual relational positioning. This is my podcast. I am the facilitator of it. I'm introducing myself from a certain context. I'm inviting you in a certain context. And that's not undifferent than the doctor or the priest or the Mi'kmaq elder, right? I mean, you are saying, hey, I need to be part of this. And you notice that it has a performative element to it, right? Like the nature of hosting a podcast. So on one hand, we have the form and the boundary condition of the relationship, right? Which is structured. And on the other hand, within that structure, we try to find that free-flowing, sometimes chaotic response to that order. And this is this is the dynamic, right? This is the ever-shifting tension. This is the nature of life, right? When you talk about, I think it was Holland that said, life lives on the edge of chaos, right? That sense of ordered islands in a sea of chaos that are constantly shifting and moving, right? It's something about a dynamic here. So we don't want to shut it down in the rigidity of, like you said, like the pro forma doctor's visit, that is already has already been set before it even started. Or the pro forma Catholic confession, or the pro forma interviewer in a podcast, right? So there is that sense that we could go into ordered schema. On the other hand, we could just have absolute cacophony and chaos and randomness, and maybe that could be sort of enjoyable in some kind of cathartic way, but it may not be what we'd say is wisdom, right? Or as we try to find that. So I think already, right, we're looking at these notions, and the one that I really loved is, like you said, about the notion of being in performance and yet wanting to be in the flow, and this is not your word, mine, but the authenticity of the dialogue. And again, I don't think that performance and authenticity are at odds with each other. You can be authentically performing and performing such that an authenticity comes forward. So if you think of those three things, and this would be a natural segue for me into the notion of the shaman, right? But the shaman was a unified role that became multi-rolled, right, as modernity forwarded. So, and you hear it in these related words, right? So, for example, the priest we'll call him as a minister, right, and has a ministry. And we see the stuff, the prefix there, min. In health, we talk about administering or ministrations, right? Like, so a physician is going to administer a medication. My patients are going to receive my ministrations, right? My healing techniques. And so there's that word min that shows up again. And then the performer, especially sort of more in medieval and older times, that sort of bardic character, right? We talk about as the minstrel, right? So we see that somewhere this is hearkening to a deeper archetype, right? Where the minstrel, um, the minister, and the one that perform ministrations or ministrations, that in terms of our healing was probably actually a solitary, it was embodied in a single individual, right? Um, and I can't help but wonder if that, that actually points back to, what we're, modern vernacular calling the shaman, within a Paleolithic or hunter-gatherer type community, because they had all of those elements, right? They had the element of spiritual authority in the voicing, perhaps of vision, or they had the performative aspect in song and dance, but being danced and sung in a spirited way. And obviously the healing aspect, and whatever that be through herbs or touch or, other types of work. And so we saw that that was all held in a unified way. But already in our conversation, right? I mean, it's not by mistake that we brought in the doctor, the priest, and the performer into play, right? Like, I just find that really interesting that that came in a natural, sort of unrehearsed way, in the sense of the stories, in the sense of what our compass is aimed towards, right?
Yeah, I really, really love that you bridged the performance and the authenticity, because that is actually co-occurrent with an insight that I've had from another dialogue and have just been sort of digesting over the last few months. So that's sort of a spot on, like, fusing of two neurons for me that has begun to shift my understanding of what I'm supposed to do in order to facilitate and participate well. And I'm just noticing I'm like, there's a sort of quality to the way that we are moving through the dialogue and the way that you're moving the dialogue and moving with it, that it's interesting to me. And I'm interested that I don't yet understand or have a sense of, but it's kind of similar to reading your book, actually. Like, I feel like I'm being led on this sort of this journey, and I don't know where quite it's leading to, but there is a sense of leading up to some sort of, it's like the movement and shifting out of one paradigm into another paradigm and closing that paradigm or something like that.
What if we shifted the word leading to pulling? Because this isn't like, I'm not in a Socratic mode here, right? Where I'm trying to get Jacob to a certain understanding, and I'm going to lay forth a series of, interesting questions that is going to sort of funnel towards an endpoint that I'd like you to arrive in my understanding or what have you. So this isn't Socratic, right? It's not that. So there's not a leading here. And so I'm not leading, nor am I necessarily feeling led, but there's a pulling, right? And the pulling to me feels more like, and this was with the writing of the book too, and this is with these things, which is there a mode in any of these exchanges, in any of these orderings of relationship, where that truly improvised spirit takes place? And for me, when that starts to kick in, it feels more like running through the woods at night, right? Like, there's all sorts of hazards. It's dark. Maybe it's moonlit, maybe it's not, maybe it's overcast, maybe it's not, but there is branches and there's brambles and there's rabbit holes and there's rocks and there's roots, and all of those potential disasters waiting to happen are there. And yet I feel like I'm running through the woods quite quickly, ever more quickly. And I'm somehow not hitting those things. And I'm somehow running through the woods. And I don't know where this ends. And I don't know where I come out. And I don't know where it finishes. But this is an element, like when we talk about embodied trust, like, this is what trust feels like to me, right? Like, it actually has a feeling of a movement, of a progression through a landscape, an experiential one. It's not a noun, right? Like, it's more a descriptive term of the sensation of what this feels like when it's happening. Which speaks to many ways, how you, again, we struggle for the articulation, right? Like, it's like, you're like, oh, but there's this sort of living, unfolding, and da da da. I'm just saying, don't give them the misattribution of my lead. Like, something is pulling us, right? Now, towards what? Who knows, right? I mean, It's kind of a teleological mystery, I guess. But that's more of the sensation to me, is that we're being pulled within a wisdom rather than leading, directing, orchestrating, that kind of thing.
Yeah, really well put, and also clicking with the running through a forest that I was doing about an hour and a half before this call, and had just discovered a very sort of tight trail where the track is bending and winding, and I'm actually running through it and amazed that I can just sort of, like a roller coaster on rails. I can just follow it whilst in movement.
Love that.
And that is one of the styles that's available in Dialogos, I think, is to be on a hunt, almost like we're on the hunt for something, some horizon of knowing. But I also stress that the hunt, I think, has been conceived in common parlance as something that's very sort of directed, like I'm hunting for a specific thing. And what I developed a sense of later reading was that the hunt is much more of that feminine attunement to the environment and listening, in the way that the hunter, and I suppose the shaman as well, in the context of the forest, is sort of listening out with all of the senses, with not quite knowing what it's listening for. It's just a real attuning to background.
No, that's lovely, Sid, and I agree that the hunt has become very myopic, right, and very intentional, right? We have to get this, our prey, our quarry. But the exemplars I always refer back to are it's traditional Bushman culture, and to the degree that I got to meet and participate and be with these Bushman elders, both indirectly through a mentor of mine, Bradford Keeney, and directly, and we had a chance to go to Namibia.
I would love to hear about both of those, by the way, if
Yeah.
are willing to unpack a little bit just how that came about.
Well, first wave of it too, but to start with just the metaphor, because in this case, it's the specifics of my story I don't think are as important as what they're offering in this metaphor that you're pointing to. And so again, we see this sort of where we like to break it apart, right? So the anthropologists will talk about the Bushman dance. It's sort of been misnamed a trance dance because it's not really a trance state. It's a much fuller expression of connectivity rather than sort of narrowing or hyper focus. But the Bushmen themselves, or others around, often like to refer to it as the great dance, right? And it's the world's oldest healing tradition. It's a community dance. It's fully ecstatic. It is song. It is dance. It is movement. It's trembling hands. It's by the fire. It's in the desert under the Southern Cross and the Kalahari skies, and in this ancient form. And we look at the rock art, 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 years old. I mean, just inconceivable amounts of human time that this tradition has been intact and expressed. And then other anthropologists have noted, the persistent hunt, this amazing, hunting before we even had weapons, like this notion of this tracking. And the Bushmen are known as the greatest trackers on the planet. But the interesting thing about their tracking is they don't see it. I mean, there is all the level of skill, right? Like this track versus that track, this animal versus that animal, old versus new, female, male, pregnant, young, old, all of the details of the tracking. Was here 3 days ago, this kind of thing that we think about the skill set of tracking. But there's so much more than that. Like the tracking for them is like how we read books. They literally read the landscape, with all of the crisscrosses of all of the animals and the winds and the elements and the people. And so now their tracking now is also about storytelling, because they're going to come back and share that shared language of what they've seen. And by the way, it's usually paired. They have a there's a saying in tracking: when you track alone, you're always right, right? Because you're going to read it as you do. But when you track in dialogue with somebody else, there's challenge and there's feedback, and there's counterpoints and references to get a better sense of the read. But they literally read the land just like we do a book. But the land is like separate chapters, right? If you're out on this part of the land, you might have this chapter, and somebody else is in another part of the land and they have another chapter, and there's linkages. There's a plot line that flows through the day, the week, the month, the year, a lifetime, generations into the ancestors. And so when they bring those tracks back, they share the story of the day and their experience of it, so that the fuller story and an embodied story, their embodied experience of this fuller reading emerges. So not only are they reading, but they're like play performers. They're in the reading as well. Like they're making the tracks that are adding to the story, right? Like how cool is that? You read a book and you're adding your own lines in, right? About your participation in it. It's sort of a very full kind of reading. But they'll also talk about becoming the animal, right? Like there's this sort of mimetic change where they literally start to, in this deep empathy, feel it. And it's beyond just an empathy. It's a spiritual connection. They'll feel, and they mean quite literally, like there are ropes between them and the animals they hunt. They'll wake up and feel a tap on the shoulder, or a tap on the shoulder, or a tap on the back, and tap in the back. And this is information of what is calling them. And they may see the animal in a dream, and they'll literally feel kinesthetically pulls in their body. And so, yes, they are tracking, but yes, they are becoming. And yes, back to that notion of pulling, they're literally being pulled to the animal, right? And so this is a dance too. So they're now being danced, right? So this notion of dance, hunting, tracking, the story, you could put them as three separate metaphors, and I will in conversation, but they're really all the same, right? It's this type of incredible interaction. And it holds with the central mythology, the notion of a first world or a first creation, or a second world and a second creation. And the first world is one of flux and change and, ever, sort of chaotic twistings and movings, and nothing ever staying set. And the second creation is like the world we're in. Out of all of those crazy possibilities, this one called consistency, or this one called, frozenness, or a reification, becoming of something, from this pure verb state to the nouns and the world of naming. And so at this point, the beginning of time and death and birth and illness, and things became things, and we became different. But these worlds are always living. It's not like the first creation ceased. This was just one expression that just got held out. And so all of this then is about the interplay between these two worlds of being, which, by the way, isn't different than, for example, what Ian McGilchrist is saying in The Master and the Emissary about the left and the right hemisphere. Like we actually have these two worlds and perceptive places within our own being. So of course it's going to be part of the mythology. And with the Bushman's wisdom of tens of thousand years, they actually found the embodied balance between these two hemispheres that they have in their minds, like they're as human beings. And so these are very potent. So what does that mean as the meta-modern people we are from these very, very ancient, ancestral, and archaic places and expressions and masteries? Right now, the first place we have to admit is we have a tremendous poverty we're like, moth-eaten to the extreme of what we understand and how we can be in that way relationally with an interconnected, interrelational world in its oneness. But they're great pointers, right? So they point to us as the beginning. And to be quite honestly, when this is coming out in our talk now, right? We're trying to play, these things are coming forward and all of these things. And even through this crazy thing called the internet and Zoom and podcasts and recording, and we've never met face to face. We are trying to, play with these notions, catch each other's story, and ideally, hopefully feel the pull, right? Not just hear words, but actually start to rev up this kind of embodied sense of here you are, here I am. Isn't that great? Do you feel it? Are you starting to, there you go. Are you starting to come into, am I coming alive? Are you coming alive? And even if it's the most impoverished kind of way, just a dance of words over screens, can we actually start to dance them, right? In a way that shifts us in meaningful ways. And this is the kind of thing that I just love, and honestly, this is, to me, always the reference, and this is always the work, no matter what the context or the situation.
Wow. Really wonderfully put. And just that end note of the distinction of doing something with somebody, doing something in a context where you get something done, and doing something in a context where the thing getting done is a shift in state as well. And for me, it's interesting, like the pulling initially doesn't quite, like, it doesn't pull. The word pulling doesn't pull for me. But then I think about what is the aspect that lights me up, and the feeling of how I sort of map the shape of this is kind of like this. It's a sort of through the roots and up to the branches, sort of vertically through me, and then sort of branches going out the back of my head and into my deeper psyche and past, and branching out through into this, and then back into the back of your psyche, and those correspondences that occur without either of our meditating or understanding, those I feel are drawn together. And there's something about getting the flow in the middle of that to have a certain quality that kind of takes on its own generator function. And we also sort of tend to it and alchemize it as we move through it. So we can kind of speed it up and slow it down. But in either case, once we're in that zone of flow, then the connections are being made in a way that is beyond the logical sum of our capacities individually. And so for me, there was a lot in the physical thing that you were doing here. This felt like it was conveying a lot, and I had these sort of psychedelic Mandelbrot set type images in my head of what I sort of feel when I try to give image to the sort of fundamental edge weavingness of being at every level. And that it seems to me like a constant fractal meeting and not quite meeting that is creative, and it's always sort of occurring and happening. So it draws up a lot for me. But I really connect with this shamanic, archaic wisdom, because as I have become more whole, those ways of making sense have become much more relevant to me, and I've connected with that way of understanding the world, and I've also connected much more deeply with nature and spent more time in nature, which is conducive toward that, and like shifting from not really having any relationship to nature or to the senses in my body below here to sort of opening up here and getting into dimensionality, and then getting to a point where I could feel my gut and subtle sensations in my gut, and with that, like the real, like really being able to appreciate trees, and then noticing the buds more, and then even the subtle movement of all of the leaves through the trees, and how that sort of discloses the wind. And so I feel that in some way we're dropping back down to a deeper participatory sense-making, relevance, realization place that is somehow always true, but we've stacked so many layers on top, and especially with the written word, I think, and the sort of aesthetic architectural landscape that we've created in cities, we've sort of obscured that we can read the world in this way, and trained ourselves to read it in a very specific way, which is sort of straight across the line and down to the next one. Yeah.
and just, yeah, sure. And for example, like the reading the way we do our reading of books, right? I mean, again, that's a very much a representation of something, that was obviously founded in much more richness. And certainly any story that we tell is going to be a representation, but there's so many more, like even our representations can be so much more rich in their retelling than they often are, or that we often allow them to be, right? To really find that living sense of, I think a rule that I try to live by is never tell a story the same way twice. You may have a story that you tell many times, but never ever tell it the same way twice, because you're different, the listener is different, the context is different. There's always a shifting. And yet so often we like to, our, like, again, like the doctor's office, we have our script or rehearsal and we want to go through it in the way that we know that we want to go through it. As you talked, I loved your pushback against pull, but because the notion of pull isn't what's central either. There can be the notion of push or drive, right? So if I'm the hunter in a given moment, I'm being pulled by the land I'm reading, this rope, this animal that's probably yet unseen, often yet unseen, right? But I'm being pulled towards it with no assurance in any rational sense that it's there, but in an embodied sense that, okay, this is pulling me, pulling me. And you'll notice the whole thing about the pull, though, is it brings out the notion of aesthetics versus pragmatics. And there's a very pragmatic reason that hunter-gatherers hunt. They need meat for their kids. That's the whole reason we're here, right? We had very skillful ancestors that were able to put, meat into mouths for countless generations before we ever got here, and food that was gathered. And, I think the Bushman women in many ways think of gathering as a hunting activity too. Bushes can hide, right? They have their way of showing themselves or not showing themselves. And so, but in the same moment, right, the hunter isn't always the hunter. Sometimes the hunter becomes the prey. And then you're going to have the notion of being driven, right? You're going to be being pushed from behind. You're going to be driven somewhere. And so the idea of the push and pull, this thing that brings us towards, or like that we, leading from the front or being driven from behind, these are part of the same, beautiful dynamics, right, that are shaping these relations. I think most of the time, if you approach this aesthetically, I mean, the vast majority of the time, without, then probably could find some trivial examples that could go this, but if you take care of the aesthetics, the pragmatics take care of themselves. If you live, like if you're deeply embedded in the aesthetics of the relation and context as it's unfolding, right? The Bushmen do put away to find food, on the proverbial table. They don't have tables, but but they get the prey, they get the animal. The pragmatics take care of itself. They bring it home. People are happy, but it's not primarily a pragmatic act. And just as when you're out with them, they're actually very not that stressed about getting animals, right? They're not like, oh shit, we have to do this. Oh gosh, I'm anxious, we're not getting it. They're joking, they're chatting, they're moving. They're always in inquiry, curiosity, play, interest. Aesthetics are primary. You mentioned the psychedelic, and I'm just going through just the number of things that just sort of popped off, that each of them going in 1,000 ways, but the notion of a Mandelbrot imagery or the sort of fractal imagery. But again, that's sort of an aesthetic notion too, right? And so the notion of the dance, bringing forth song, these of dream and vision and feeling, like these are, again, a type of organizing that are part of a broader synesthesia ultimately, right? As you transition into the dance, into the hunt, into storytelling of these ways, sight isn't just sight, hearing isn't just hearing, taste isn't just taste, touch isn't just touch. These things begin to mix and merge, and you can very well have a very felt sense of these broader qualities and mysteries, right, that we move into. And so, but again, I see that not as separate. Oh, like this is a psychedelic experience. Like this is out of, this is somehow different. No, this is part of these broader openings into our perceptual, both that sensual, perceptual, embodied nature. And they become, again, the tools of play. Like if you start to see a set of fractal connections between all of the parties and the animals, and what are ropes but a fractal matrix and lattice, right, going out into the world of these interconnections. And then you recognize that your song vibrates that rope or reorganizes the structure and brings people together in a resonant way, or pushes people together in a dissonant way. And you're not just feeling it, but you're seeing it and you're hearing it, and the song is modulating in response to this. And now there is this mystery of this, how we organize as organisms, in our social collection and social collectiveness, right? This is fascinating, and this is, I think, where Jordan Hall likes to go on to talk about resonance and coherence, and I love that he points to that there's an experience of this, right? Not just the abstraction of this, but how do we go further, right, into the language and the experience that this is really is deeply experiential, and it's mundane. Like for the Bushman, it really is every day, right? It's not. It isn't, this other peak, right? Like it really is that this is life, and yet you'll see that they're literally grounded in the daily living, right? Like in just being with each other, held by the land in the relationships. Spouses are spouses, children are children, the elders are elders. They are just this lovely communing, and when they're at their best, very content and happy people. Now, I don't want to glorify the Bushmen. They're under the stress of modernity in terrible ways and have been for decades, if not centuries, like all of us. So, there is the modern Bushman, and we still have the chance, up to this perhaps last generation, to see the vestiges that point back to an older type of way of being in the world. So again, a legacy of some richness, but again, richness that is still progressively being lost, generation to generation. And there's a real tragedy in that, but that's another topic and another kind of grieving, perhaps, for another time. But anyway, I literally just throw those right back at you, as and maybe that's not necessarily simple lines and segues from what you said, but there's a bunch of nonlinearity that can fly off and wherever you want to take it.
I have no doubt that there is. And I had the image of like building like Legos or little stick connects, and then like sort of throwing the artifice over to the other person, and then like, now you're gonna put some connects in it.
That's a good image. That's a very good image.
I guess at these moments I tend to slow down a little bit, as it's not so much a not knowing where to go or not feeling that there are places to go, but wanting to sort of plumb the depth a little bit. I wonder, well, first of all, just to speak to and connect with what you spoke to about psychedelics, that's very much my understanding, is the more these things are integrated over time, the less it becomes about the psychedelic experience, and the more it becomes about the psychedelic nature of reality, and sort of bringing through what is experienced there into what is experienced in the day-to-day, which, yeah, I think there's a getting down under some layers that is required in order to sort of be at rest in participating with the banality. Like there's a way in which I feel we have to undergo a complex process, or I've had to undergo a complex process in order to get in touch with the simple. And that is also the process of sort of dissolving some of those deeper inherited dualisms or disembodied relationship to reality in the soil, in the roots, whether that's the immediate sort of collective roots of the last 3 generations and the wars, the world wars, or the Industrial Revolution, or whether you want to go deeper down into sort of the consequences of the Enlightenment, or even the consequences of Christianity as a narrative structure that we sort of lived out of for many centuries, in a really psychedelic way, actually, I think, in which it wasn't so much that was over there in the past and we are here now, and it was more that through all of the aesthetics of the artwork and the storytelling and the buildings and the way the world was actually experienced was through that narrative world. And it's such a, I mean, this has just been something that's been alive for me today, so I'm bringing it in and seeing what you make of it. The enormity of that narrative structure in which we were embedded, sort of from Christianity, or maybe you want to go down to Judaism, 3,000 years or 4,000 years, to have that break down as it has, and to have the greatest story structure ever told, so to speak, fold in on itself and to sort of find oneself on the other side of that story, which I believe is where we are in some sense. There is a necessity of finding ground again in experience, or in not knowing, as compared dialectically with narrative. And this is the movement, I think, that this drawing up of the archaic, of the indigenousness of the way of experiencing life, that is sort of has to be drawn up and reincarnated and re-embodied through in a way that has not been for many centuries, perhaps normatively. And yet with that, returning to experience and not knowing, we don't get rid of the narrative capacity, the compulsion of story, and to tell a story about oneself, about the world, about one's experiences. That's still there. And now we find ourselves with all these different narratives and stories that we can pull on and find truth and wisdom in dialectic with a relationship to experience, which is ultimately grounded in the ineffable, the mystery. And so I'm interested in how you see reconciliation in this very fraught, discordant, confusing, accelerationist time that we are in.
Yes. No. Yeah. So, I mean, my first little caveat is I am ambivalent about psychedelics per se. That doesn't mean I'm against it or I'm for it. I'm really, truly ambivalent, because my experiences with them, I think that's the wisest position, right? Like I think ambivalence is actually the right centered position rather than pro against, benevolent, malevolent. I don't take that. I think this shows reveals complexities, right? Both of light and shade in my being and in the world. And so I don't want to be anybody's marketer. Psychedelics don't need me as their marketer, that's for sure. So I want to take everything from that ambivalent position and experience. And one of the things that, I mean, in just what you said there were so many parts there that were assumptive, right? About the role of narrative, about the importance of narrative, from 3,000 years of the Judeo-Christian tradition, all of these different things, right? And but so narrative, belief, thought, history, these the things that we pull out of a timeline. I think the problem is that the psychedelic is just going, often if you go in with narrative, you will get the amplification of the importance of narrative. And you will get the multiplication of narrative. And, you will get this world of, you're like this, like the house of mirrors of endless variations of narrative. And I think from a traditional person's perspective, that kind of sounds like a tricksterish place. That sounds like a pretty tricksterish place to end up with. And I see that, my own experience, with it too, shows that narrative is ready. Just like if we are very unpracticed, if we are unpracticed being in the present moment, being in the flow of a conversation and dialogue, perhaps using narrative, but in a very, again, improvised, new, fresh way in service to our broader life. But most of us don't have that kind of discipline, right? Most of us are being pulled into the I, the you, the we space. We're being pulled into our timelines, our individual timelines, our collective timelines. Mine's different than yours. Yours is different from mine. That's a good one. This is a bad one. Oh, they're all good and bad, like blah, 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 blah. But we just keep filling up the space with these senses of narrative and identity and all of these positions. And if you come in with that, and that's what you're practiced in, then the psychedelic experience is just going to explode that on you, with even, fancier, bigger, more impressive, mind-blowing visual. And what is a vision? I mean, a vision is a narrative too, right? I mean, a vision is a thought. I mean, it's an image versus a soundtrack of words or what have you. But, we're in this, now we're fully in the narrative, right? But right now I ask you, like in this moment, right? Like in this moment, where's the narrative? Like right now, like where is this narrative? Right? Is it what we said 5 minutes ago? Well, no, I mean, I'm willing to admit that we are in a stream, like Heraclides. We're in a stream that is flowing through in this moment. But that's not my timeline. Those are just cherry-picked and highly impoverished points of perspective that I'm actually bringing up in this moment right now and saying, this is my past, present, and future. But it's really just something coming here in this. So what is my advice for, and this is actually an important question for me as a physician in mental health, because we know psychedelics are coming down in a very medicalized way. Like in Canada, ketamine is already legal for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Cannabis has been legal recreationally, and so there's some movement towards the notion of a cannabis-assisted psychotherapy. Certainly MDMA is coming down the pike, psilocybin is coming down the pike. It will probably be led by the Americans and FDA approval, but we've soon seen afterwards that will come forward, right? So this is really coming into the landscape. And I have worries about that because, again, it comes into the landscape in a way where we've really reified narrative, right? So we're going to help somebody's trauma. But you notice that trauma is this like deeply embedded noun rather than a noun that is reference to the trauma that happened then and how you're, then the projections of how you will be if we don't treat it. And now we come into this and, again, that's its own narrative, right? I mean, trauma is a narrative, and that's not to minimize people's suffering and struggling, for the fact that things have happened that have been wounding and deeply and often egregiously so and without justice. I understand that, but in this moment, like, show me my trauma. Like in this moment, show me your trauma. Like I'm going to have to evoke a kind of creation, right? A kind of, again, this sort of narrative of things into this living moment. And I don't think that is wise actually with psychedelics, because now, don't get me wrong, there could be two outcomes. You can be freed from your narrative into another narrative, right? And we're like, oh, that's a healthy switch. We've gone from because the research shows that it's working, right? So we've gotten out of your trauma narrative, and now you're pro psychedelic. This is the best medication ever narrative, but we're still in narrative, right? And no, it's okay. I would take that result if I was struggling and suffering too. I'm not going to minimize that. But is there another way to be with these things, right? And that is actually not, because that's sort of still an illness model, right? You had trauma and now we cured it and now you don't have it, right? And yeah, who doesn't want a good cure if we can find it? I get that. But that's not a health model, right? That's not a health model of our presence, of our embodiment, of our contextual relationship to the world. I may feel better, but the world is still like in the throes of its, perhaps of its death cries and it's needing to be midwifed out. Like, so where is this play, right? So to me, the psychedelic is best, and I think the indigenous people point to it and say, listen, here's every day, right? This is your everyday. This is really important what you do in the everyday. Because if you're in narrative mind every day, you're like constantly in thought. And thought isn't bad. It's part of being a human. But if your thoughts are abducting the totality of your attention most of the day, when you give a psychedelic, you're going to move up into the second place where the narrative is just fed and amplified. And the scariest notion of that is an incredible narcissism, right? It's like, oh, I can't be narcissistic. I've had all these ego deaths. Well, you have a narrative now called ego death. And, I've had this and I have this. And yet there was that little bit of whatever that remained, just so core. And now it's being amplified and all sorts of crazy speech and positioning and ordering can come from that place. And we're seeing it just go on the damn internet. There's a lot of emergent, ayahuasca, Gen Z millennial shamans. I've had my 30 things and now I see, and now I'm leading and da-da-da-da. And it's like, wow, that's just a proliferation of this, dominoes of narrative to narrative to narrative and belief to belief to belief. All right, what's the other mode then? Well, the other mode is more like we talked about. It's more, again, the dance, the hunt, and even the telling of story from this mode, the telling of story from your living, feeling, and body, and the expression of an improvised moment, which was what is going on in this body, right? What is the sensation? What is the seeing, hearing, tasting, touching? What is the synesthesia of that? What is the vibratory feel of that as having a body? And of course, under psychedelics, the notion of a body can be a very different thing. That is true, but without getting into a narrative of that. And then, of course, the breakdown of the body to the world itself, right? Like into Gaia, into the forest you're part of, into the context that's holding you, to the nature of these very medicines, right? Like psilocybin and our relationship to this huge ancient family of being called fungi, right? Like, for example, all of these types of things. And so now what story is coming out? Well, it's a story of an ancient body. Well, this is a body that's not, as a human, is 200,000 years, as Homo sapien, as Homo something or other, 2-3 million years, as mammals longer, and back down the evolutionary tree. Wow, that's a story to be allowed to come forth and express. And of course, once you go down that, then you're literally saying, in this moment, I am allowing the story of the earth herself, this sense of all my relations, right? In many of the indigenous traditions, we have all of my relations, the notion of all of the connection, right? That their story can come down. And then even beyond the all my relations, which is a sense of the seen, there's the relationship with the unseen, the ancestors that we still have loving connection to and memory of and feeling for, right? And the unseen powers of creation, the mystery, and the mystery is mysterious, the mysterious and tremendum, whatever that is, right? We have a chance for that story to come through. And so if you start with the body as the primary, not as the narrative, you're going to end up in an other body's story, right? The body of evolution, the body of the world itself, the body of the seen and the unseen, right? Coming forward. And I would argue that that's where most of the traditional indigenous people that use these kind of medicines worked and went to, right? And if you came out with one narrative, it was, what was your relationship to all of that? What was your gifts in relationship to that? What was your challenges in relationship to that? And this is what we call a vision. But a vision doesn't grandize. It just tells you, this is your relationship in the world. Isn't it great that you're not alone? You have relationship. You're being held by this. And to me, if we're getting outside of that, I have very little use for psychedelics. I respect the trickster. I love when the trickster is play. And I'm not saying the trickster is a bad character. A trickster isn't the devil in indigenous societies. The trickster is just tricky and is always using word and story and mischief and the multiplication of narrative to get people into trouble, including himself, which is so wonderful. At least he's not a hypocrite, that trickster. He's always getting himself in trouble too. But so there's the two places, right? There is this broader place that is of first creation, is of shifting, changing, is of the story of creation itself. And then there is all of these other stories that are just stories of themselves that a trickster will make. Yeah, that's my rant today on psychedelics.
That was really nice. And I definitely felt the quality of caution that I would expect from a doctor, first and foremost, and a movement into a lot of complexifying and deepening, which took me on a whole journey as I was listening to it. And I got a sense at some point that it wasn't really about narrative or not narrative as such, but narrative being a word which we can sort of intone towards many different dimensions of experience, and sort of moving between a lot of those as I was listening to you.
And there's distinctions, right? Like you mentioned, not knowing, right? Knowing and not knowing. And that's a really important distinction. But recognize you've got to think about where is the place then that we settle into and open from that opens to not knowing versus a place that we settle into and move from that is just going to throw us into more and more layers of knowing. Even if it's new knowing, fantastic knowing, insight, right? So again, that's not, we have a brain, a left and a right. One likes knowing, one's comfortable with not knowing. We have mythologies, of God and trickster. One is the not knowing and mystery, and one loves knowing. Like these comes up in so many different ways in our being, our life, and our culture. It's shown to us in so many ways. And but the knowing game is just the circus, right? It's just it's the three rings. It is endless. It is entertaining. It is at times useful if we, don't get me wrong, I'm not knowing, but it's anti-knowing. But it's always secondary for me, right? It always has to come out of the deeper primary, the whole, the mystery, wisdom that births these knowings and then comes back and helps me to interact with these primaries again in a different way. But I have to make sure that the primary of wisdom and not knowing and the whole is first, and the secondary of knowing, my narratives and my small worlds of construction, are second, and that these are in right relations, right? But if I invert the two and I make my knowings primary, my narratives primary, well, this inversion is going to create nothing but pathologies. And in the trickster stories, that's why the trickster's always getting in trouble, because he's always working from this inverted place, right? It's a cautionary tale. So just invert the inversion, right? Make wisdom the mystery, the body, the relationship, rather than, the verbs rather than the nouns. Make this primary. And then these other secondary aspects, they're part of our human being. I'm not shunning them, but now they can be in service rather than being usurpers of our experience.
And what's coming through for me in that is a recognition of the form of the communication context in which narrative is held, and that somehow, like, that it were the case that whenever narrative was to be discussed or espoused, it was taking place in this dialogic and dialogo sort of emergent context in which the ultimate message was not the narrative that we decided on so much as the creative process through which we arrive and create it with. And that seems to convey something that is below those particularities of narratives, and would, I think, be pretty transformative to the relationships between a whole host of narratives, understandings, layers, and dimensions. But there is relationship that is ground of that as well, and there's a real commitment to sort of showing up in a fellowly manner in order that we can participate in this way. And there's a whole load of skills and obstacles that both of us have probably had to overcome in order to get to a place where we can participate in this way with one another.
Yeah, I love that. So let's put some names to parts of that. So let's see if we can use a naming skillfully, right? So the context that you just spoke to, what I would say that shows up the vast majority of the time, not always, right? Like in moments of deep grief or something, this will be different. But the vast majority of time, I think, if we look at the wakes that have been left from the indigenous and the archaic, would say that play is the context that holds this the vast majority of time. That is actually, the notion of coming together in this constructive, co-creative notion of dialogue, of story making, of exchange and play, right? And you notice we use the word play for what we how kids play, and this thing we do on stage, we call it a play. And that's probably an old remembrance, right? That says, again, back to the performative aspect that we talked about, that this should be playful, right? Because in play, feelings don't get hurt, right? I push back against the little craziness that you said, and you push back against some craziness that I said, and we're just like, that's crazy, and we're having fun with our words and our play, right? So how do we make this playful, right? But it's a serious play. It's a committed play, because you're right. We have to show up. We need to be willing to be vulnerable. When intimacy opens, then it's asking for, so remember, this is always asking for the truth of arising, right? So play holds many things for most of the day until our griefs show up, and then it might be a great sadness, a great love, an anger that needs to be expressed, right? So we need to be solid and strong, that we allow these places, right, to come forward, right, when they need to in the moment, to be expressed, to be held, not necessarily with words, but maybe with, the other thing, I mean, the Bushmen will tell you the power of touch to dialogue, right? I like to, when people say, I've been touched, I have been touched by what you've said, means that they've literally been touched. And that's the primary comparison, right? And so we'll break out into touch, into holding, into an embrace, again, holding, right? And so again, the sensual nature of, the dialogue is primarily sensual, emoted, and then spoken. And even, I love the Bushmen will say in most cases, the use, what are words useful for? For humor? They're useful for humor. So we're back to play. We have words to make some really good jokes, and they're useful for keeping people's ego in check. So they have a tradition called insulting the meat. The hunter comes back with something really big. He's going to start thinking he's a rock star if he does that 2 or 3 times in a row. That's not good for community. So now they're going to start to take him down a notch or 2 from all directions, right? And you know what that looks like again? Back to humor, but humor used in a skillful way. Right. And then they find out, then you find out that actually when you're in grief, that usually words aren't probably the least appropriate thing, right? Because when somebody's gone through a huge thing, like what I often find I'm saying is, I have no words for this moment right now. And I know you have no words for this moment right now. So what do we have? Well, we have something. I mean, it's, we have our heartfeltness, right? We have our shared sense, we have the tragedy, right, of this moment. And I don't think that's the realm of narrative. Now, at some point, maybe an inspired set of words will come out of that, right, that are healing and reknitting and bring us forth. But again, they're not primary. They're being driven by the felt sense. And then those are the words that you'll notice the speaker himself is crying, and the people listening are crying. And then we recognize, oh, we were ordered by a wisdom which is all bringing us now into our collective grief. This isn't the skill of somebody. This is our willingness to show up and be vulnerable and open and be spoken and heard, right? Like we're literally are spoken and we literally are heard. And now we are, collectively crying those tears, right? So this notion of the word that you like, dialogos, and it's a relatively new word for me. I mean, I'd obviously heard it through, podcasts of John Vervaeke and the like, but, I think that what we're pointing to, and again, this is where we try to find are we pointing to the same thing? But for me, this type of relational connectivity is, yeah, is, singularly important in my life, right? Every day, in this moment right now with you, Jacob, right? Here we are, you and I, literally crossed the Atlantic from each other, having a conversation, somehow feeling into each other's feelings. I'm very grateful by the opportunity. I know, I recognize you've given me an inordinate amount of space today, to just talk. But I want to tell you, in my gratitude, this has been very good for me today. It's been this sharing has been healing for me today. There's two listeners here. There's you, and I am hearing my own words, and I am recalibrating myself in this moment into my life today, because you've given me a chance to be able to speak and hear my own words. And I can only hope that they have been in some way useful to you or not. But I am grateful for the chance to have uttered them today. So thank you, for that.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. It's been more than a pleasure. It's been a journey through all kinds of different emotional, subtle states for me, moving through this with you. And even though it can be feeling like we're sort of talking about things in a general way, I feel a sense that for you it's very connected with your experience, and for me it's connected with my experience, and we're sort of connecting those together. And yeah, that I felt a sort of a crescendo or reprise occur in that last thread from you, and that is often how a great emerging dialogue really comes to a close. So yeah, I want to thank you, and I really feel that there's been a lot communicated to me that I really am going to be digesting on an unconscious level, probably before it becomes conscious. And so often the case with a great dialogue, that it takes some time to really understand what even transpired. So, but I'm feeling pretty good and clear and connected and in touch. So,
Yeah, and on that note, who knows? Maybe this is the one time our paths cross, and this is the moment, and these are the moments we have, and or maybe life conspires that we find a way to talk again, and in some mode or some form. I do embrace the asymmetries of all of this too. I mean, I think that's one thing I'd just say, just in closing. Very few relationships are actually symmetrical. Friendships, husband and wife perhaps, but so many other relationships work because of their asymmetry, right? Interview and interviewee, priest and parishioner, physician and patient. And the asymmetry isn't about power differences. They're structures that are wise. You can say, well, the doctor or the priest has more power over the patient or the parishioner, but the direction in this case is towards the patient or the parishioner when it's at its best, right? So is that about power? Who has the power? You know what I mean? But the asymmetries are important. And so here, you've created the space, interviewee. And so maybe I'll just say, put that as a thing to maybe play with in the sense of dialogos, right? Is that it doesn't have symmetry isn't a requirement for resonant and coherent relationship. As a matter of fact, often it is the necessary boundary conditions to create something that's just exactly right. And in a jazz quintet, all the instruments are not equal, right? In what they do or in their role or in the amount of airtime, right? But they hold each other through their necessary asymmetries. So I don't know why that popped in at the end, but it's partly, as we may invite into different types of symmetries at different times, and that can flux and flow. But maybe if our paths cross again in that way, I'd be very, very pleased to continue the discussion.
Yeah, I would certainly love that, and I take some wisdom in that last point as well. Yeah, with that, I guess to draw the recording to a close. But thank you so much, and I'm I'm going to be in the process of realizing whatever it was that drew me to speak with you, and just there's so much grounded understanding in this complexity medicine that is flowing in dialogue with what I'm trying to understand for my own role, and how I am to participate and show up in service. So thank you so much.
Just one last sharing. There's always the endless sharings, but you brought up my metaphor of complexity medicine, and I think today that's an apt medicine. This did feel like medicine, like it did feel like a medicine, and it was natured in the complexity of us meeting for the first time, bringing our experience together and sharing forth these ideas and notions that are not, obviously often shared in regular day conversation. But one of my favorite definitions of originally what they called cybernetics or second order cybernetics, the Bates and Varela, Maturana, von Forster, these thinkers, essentially the original science of complexity. There was one by a second order cybernetician named Gordon Pask, and he was asked to define cybernetics, which essentially is a way to define complexity. And I loved it, right? Which he said, so cybernetics, but again, we could put it in complexity, is the art and the science of defensible metaphors, of which this is one. And so that's a nice loose way to hold these things, right? Like, don't go to war over your metaphors. Like, they're only useful as they're useful. And I would say today complexity in medicine is a useful one, but some days it's not. Perhaps, you get to say, because it's not my metaphor, that today dialogos was a useful metaphor. But maybe today it wasn't. I don't know. The whole thing about these things, the art and the science of these namings, of the things that are of the sciences of naming, we should hold loosely, and just recognize that the art and the science is this a defensible metaphor in this moment? Is it useful? Does it point? Does it push? Does it pull? Does it serve? And if it doesn't, let's just be willing to just let that fall away and see what new metaphor comes up in the given moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to stop it now.